it is a lot about how do we make sure that our locality, the place that we live and work in the most, is meeting our needs or meeting the desires that we want.
Are you interested in how you connect to the city and place? What do you think about human geography? How can we build trust within the local community? Stay tuned for answers from Ishara Sahama.
What is the future for cities? Do you want to learn more about them? Do you want to know how others think about them? Do you want to be part of the conversation? Then this is the right place.
Welcome to What is the Future for Cities podcast. Today, I will interview Ishara Sahama, Human Geographer. We will talk about their vision for the future of cities, community engagement, urban evolution, human geography, and many more. So let's start with a proper introduction. Ishara Sahama is a human geographer who focuses on systemic change through community engagement, social justice advocacy, and systems impact measurement. Ishara is passionate about co-designing experiences, programs, or systems that leave positive and lasting impact on communities and the environment. They are skilled at transforming human emotions and socio-cultural motivations into tangible outcomes that can be easily evaluated for its impact. Leading the impact evaluation, reporting, and storytelling sphere of Eco Impact Group, Ishara works closely with stakeholders, community leaders, and members to understand the full depth and breadth of social complexity and change brought upon by external factors such as programs, services, funding, policies, cultural processes, etc. Ishara is committed to reflecting truth, lived experiences, and justice through storytelling and evaluation approaches that ensures systems accountability and transparency for positive impact. And with that, Ishara, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for your time. I highly appreciate your appearance on the podcast. And let's jump right in. What does the future of cities mean to you?
Thanks, Fanny. It's great to have this conversation with you. It's a big question to start off with. I'm someone who's a human geographer. For me, I could talk about anything and everything, but as someone who tries to actively practice understanding how people and non-people systems work together and what doesn't work, for me, the future of cities is stemming from this understanding of how we come together as people for the betterment of our social lives, as well as the quality of our lives living in urban regions. As someone who studied urban geography through my undergraduate, as well as delving into that through undergrad research and a little bit into independent projects, I thought that, okay, how do we congregate? How do we socialize together to make decisions, to engage with one another? The future of cities is a lot about how do we have respectful, collaborative engagements and create dialogue spaces for equitable community engagement. That is primarily, for me, what's most important as someone who values reciprocal care and engagements with community, local communities. And how does that integrate with planning, design, creative design, as well as urban developments?
In my circles, I rarely hear the expression human geographer. What does a human geographer do?
It's not a common term. Human geography is usually seen as an academic discipline, often under geography and environmental science. So a lot of people I've met who are in this discipline are academics or researchers, and they could range from anything from cultural geography to human geography to social. And again, the disciplines or the research areas vary from human impacts upon urban regions, climate change, the intersection of planning and the environment, intersection of cultural engagements and environmental systems. It can vary across any aspect of society. Again, it's to the interest of that individual in research. But I'm in the practitioner space, and that is completely different. I think I bring the knowledge that comes from what I've learned from a traditional knowledge perspective from university and the research training I received whilst going through university, and bringing those skills that is both research inquiry, but also deep critical thinking that a lot of geographers, environmental scientists, environmental managers bring to their profession. And how do you actually translate that into working with businesses, stakeholders, community members, in creating more equitable spaces or dialogue spaces. So from a human geography perspective, it's really about balancing people and externalities. So what is community A or individual A concerned about? What is all the factors that are impacting them and affecting their decisions upon whether it's for a life decision or a social decision or economic decision? What is impacting that on a whole system scale? And how do you make sure you meet everyone's needs, particularly if it's a collective? So from a human geography perspective, as a practitioner, it is a lot about understanding systems and how to hold space for individuals and collectives that meets everyone's needs and is not polarizing.
I love the expression of balancing community externalities. This sounds so fancy, and at the same time, for me, it's very getting to the ground level of, okay, how can we balance all the needs of the community inside and outside? Now, you are talking about communities, and I am asking you about cities. What does the city mean to you, whether that differs from the community itself?
From my perspective, as both someone who lives locally in a region that is quite suburban, as well as a human geographer practitioner, a lot of how we engage with the city is from a local perspective. So our individual and local experiences. And then from a professional or human geographer practitioner perspective, it is a lot about how do we make sure that our locality, the place that we live and work in the most, is meeting our needs or meeting the desires that we want, and it's done equitably. And that's often some of the questions that we get through the work that we get to work on with clients, is that what are the social and well-being factors that people are most concerned about that often does not get measured and evaluated or even considered? And are you the right people to help us facilitate those dialogues so that we can actually understand this better for an individual, or really for the communities that are local to a region? So from a city's perspective, I know that sometimes the dialogue can be a lot around what can urban planning and development do for its citizens. But I come from the perspective of it comes both ways. I think there's a lot of lived experience and expertise that communities have, which can inform policymaking and practitioners across urban planning, development, and design around how to actually design equitable, inclusive, and regenerative cities or urban regions that meet the needs of those local groups.
We will get back to community engagement because that's also a fairly interesting term used in various ways across the different disciplines or different fields, not just scientific disciplines. But first, since you mentioned already a few times, what does equity mean to you?
For me, equity is it's very different from inclusion. Inclusion is a lot about how do we bring everyone to the table. But equity is about what does that table look like for each individual within a community or a collective. For example, if you're engaging with a community where there is a lot of diversity in lived experience and individualities, there might be people who are senior citizens, and then those who are young people, and then those who might have a visible disability. Coming to the so-called table is not the same for everyone. So how do you build that process of participation for individuals who have varying lived experiences and lived realities that ensures that they can come and participate in equal manner because they have been seen and heard and respected for who they are and what their needs are in order to participate fully? So for me, that's what equity is about, is making sure that context is honored and respected of each individual, and that can be reciprocated in process design when you're engaging with community or engaging with different stakeholders where lived realities might differ quite drastically between people.
Thank you for the distinction between inclusion and equity. And as I understand, it's more about allowing everyone to express themselves however they want to express themselves than creating the same outcome for everyone.
Yes, that's right.
Thank you for the clarification again. Let's unpack this lovely term called community engagement. What is community engagement, and this community engagement in the context of urban planning?
Community engagement, I find, is such not a controversial term, but it's a term that has a lot of meaning across different sectors and different disciplines. that I think there's this general definition, and then there's also a general process and therefore a general understanding of what it looks like. In the disciplines that I've intersected with, which is both urban planning, geography, and environmental management, community engagement slightly differs between all three of those spaces. And in the urban planning sense, and again, I can't speak for all urban planning professionals because that's not where I'm based. That's not where my profession is based. But it does look like, how do we inform local stakeholders who are those who might be impacted by a new development or a planning procedure that was about to take place in a certain locality? What are their opinions or their arguments about X development taking place? How do we meet their needs? What do they want from this sort of new infrastructural development taking place? And how would they like to participate in this engagement to inform planners or those who are involved in that design process on making it more equitable or accessible for them? And that's just one aspect of engaging with community. A lot of it does happen at the very early stages of planning for a new development. But what happens once the development has already been established, it's been built, it's there now existing in society and real life? Now, what is the ongoing feedback process between urban planning professionals and community, and how are they tracking whether this infrastructural development is meeting the social, economic, or even governance, so from an ESG perspective, needs that they've already determined during that whole planning process? Is there a follow-up process? And for me, both professionally and personally, that is really important from a community engagement process, because it is not seen as just a once-off process. It should be reciprocal. Community never just stop engaging with their built environment. They're continuously engaging with the built environment. They are the most constant stakeholder, in my opinion, for urban planning professionals to get data, to get the feedback that they might need in order to inform better decision-making and better urban outcomes for a locality.
One of the big challenges of community engagement I came across is that it's done as a tokenistic approach. So the client says that, yes, we need to engage with the community. And then someone says, okay, I asked them once, it's done. Mm-hmm. And your description of an ongoing feedback process already addresses this tokenistic approach. Do you have any other recommendations how we can turn community engagement to this iterative, continuous feedback loop for the built environment?
There's a few ways. There's one with my professional hat on through the work I do at Eco Impact Group. That's our process. The process is really about how do we build trust within a local community. That's the first and most important step, build trust and connection. And then how do we maintain that through the process of co-design and co-facilitation with community members, as well as the client or whoever that may be, whether it's an urban professional or a urban planning design or local government, whoever that may be. I do think there should be an intermediary between a government or urban planning design agency or a developer and community, because there needs to be someone to translate what's happening between both sides. And community members have better instilled trust with someone who can speak their languages or can understand them without communicating in terms that might not appeal to them, that might not be relatable to them because it's more focused on economic development or planning outcomes. And that generally does not translate well to community members unless they've got very strong feelings about a certain development being established in their local area, or they have certain opinions that they want to express, but as not being respected on the same level as what they need or what they expect to receive. So I do think it's important that there's someone in the middle to hold that middle ground to both translate community needs and wants and to communicate what the external client or agency wants to facilitate or wants to know from community in order to build something that benefits both. But one cannot happen without the other. So I do think that you cannot have equitable design in the urban development space without properly engaging with communities. And this is why you have, let's say in my local area, quite close to the CBD in Brisbane or Magunjin, there's an inner city suburb that often gets a lot of protests and dissent from communities like local members because of what is seen as gentrification of the suburb. Because it's so close to the city, a lot of the zones are being repurposed for high-rise development. But this is also an area that is quite significant from a cultural and arts perspective, as well as Indigenous ties to land. So developers and urban planning professionals meet the needs of local communities whilst also meeting the needs of housing demand and the need for high-rise development that has been legally approved in inner city areas, which is not very common in urban areas in Australia. That's just an example of what happens when you don't have continuous engagement with community, is that you're always going to get dissent, even escalated to a protest at some point last year where they blocked off the roads because they were so enraged about proposed new developments that were taking place just further down the road from one of the main roads in that suburb. It goes to show that you need someone who's a consistent presence within these local groups and localities to communicate both with community and to government or to urban developers.
Interesting the example you brought up, because I have been traveling in Europe and we were discussing how cities need to change, obviously, because I'm a future of cities researcher. That's what I'm talking about with everybody. And it was very interesting to talk about how we want to keep the character of the place, the locality of the place, but also we need to meet the demands of housing. And it's very interesting you say that if the community is involved, or as far as I understood, if the community is involved, there could be found a solution which keeps the locality, keeps the character, helps the locals meet their own needs, at the same time also creating enough housing for the increasing urban population. Do you feel that it's really a solvable problem with the community engagement? Because I think problems are solvable, it's just sometimes a bit harder or more challenging.
I think community engagement is one side of this problem. It is, as most problems are, complex. I think community engagement is one aspect of meeting in the middle. There is also the fact that there is deeply embedded or interdependent narratives of politics involved, particularly in the cities that are dotted across Australia. You have a really strong presence of political agendas involved with urban development. And then you've also got aspects of strong commercialization demands and what that looks like in terms of big development. It's complex. Like, community engagement is one side of it. I do think there's also the policy and procedural side that needs to change from a development perspective on whether we should be developing for gaining profit and making sure that we can meet the needs of population demand through, let's say, infill development. But whether that's actually meaningful in the long term is yet to be seen. And it's quite interesting. I'm based in Southeast Queensland, and there have been reports that have talked about how Queensland itself can do, and this is a quote by the Queensland Conservation Council, Queensland can do better planning and end the current reliance on urban sprawl. And urban sprawl is such a huge issue here. It is something that was premised to a lot of us when we were in undergrad, and those obviously postgrad and researchers. When I first started studying, this was like 2016 or so. Back then, urban sprawl in Southeast Queensland was not as extensive as it is now, but it was always seen as this is a rising problem. How we're going to meet the needs of a rising population in this region of Australia, but also contending with higher transport costs, higher need for car dependency, more pollution, more expenses in terms of infrastructure development and maintenance because we are sprawling from the CBD. And then eventually we'll have a mega city line between Sunshine Coast to Gold Coast, which is yet to happen, but it's well on its way. But I do think that these are things which have to address climate responsive solutions. How do we actually meet these needs of both citizens in the short term, but also issues that are far more complex and long term that need to be climate sensitive or climate responsive and are environmentally, ecologically, and socially responsible? I do think that the planning and development industry have a great potential to meet that and solve that. But it comes from both the top-down and bottom-up approach. You do need local community members who are both activated and knowledgeable about how they can give feedback and engage in open consultations, as well as planning professionals and developers who are integrating internal evaluation processes to understand how do we maintain longevity of our developments that don't just meet short-term needs, but are responsive to climate-sensitive design.
I love that you just described what the community needs to do, what the developers and urban planning professionals need to do, because I wanted to ask, what is the government's role in this community engagement topic?
I would say I don't know in its entirety because it does differ across different departments and different sectors. I know that from friends and other colleagues who are in more of the ecological conservation side, local and state government are very proactive in engaging with community, as well as taking on that feedback and incorporating it in ways that are communicated transparently, because this has got to do with ecological conservation. Part of why both the Conservation Council as well as Planning Institute of Australia have been so aligned with their communications around this is because of the lack of natural corridors for wildlife and natural habitats here in Southeast Queensland. And you can see it. It is very visible with the amount of urban sprawl and new infill development that's taking place. You once have untouched land, which is quite dense with vegetation, now being used as new plots, new acreage for suburban development. And that is just looking at those parcels of land, which is what the terms that they use. They are natural habitats for a lot of wildlife. And once they're built for residential living, these habitats become quite fragmented and leads to a lot of death of koalas and other wildlife. And it has a long-term cumulative effect, I would say, on ecosystem balance, because you have people encroaching on natural habitats, which one causes a disruption in the environment, but also upon how do we actually care for a country where we are constantly disturbing the balance of nature versus people here. And then also contending with all this built up area is now making suburban areas quite hot. And so you've got the urban heat island effect, where urban regions are much hotter than regional or rural areas, despite climate differences and atmospheric differences, purely because we have a dependence on cars. And the more suburban redevelopments are being built, the further and further they are from the CBD, the more car dependent they are, because transport infrastructure cannot meet urban development or suburban development demands. And so you have fragmented areas between quite far suburban areas and the city. And I think that is something that needs all aspects of government to collaborate and connect with, both from a community level, but also nature conservation, but particularly, and I think importantly, working and collaborating alongside those who are Indigenous to the land, so cultural knowledge holders, to understand what it is like to care for country through land management, as was done traditionally for many generations before, I would say, the British colony came over to Australia, because that was how the land was managed. But now we are living in a way that is unsustainable for how to manage both the land and the land around urban developments. And that is becoming quite, at least in Southeast Queensland, I would say, is becoming quite visible to see, particularly with the number of bushfires that happen near suburban developments, particularly the further out you go from the city, because they're so close to natural corridors and forests. They are more prone to burning, and burning that is unregulated. So if there are areas that have not gone through a burning process for a long time, they are primed to start big bushfire. And that is actually more disastrous for the area than it is if you have planned burns. So that's just one aspect of what I think should happen with government working across multiple sectors and with multiple agencies and organizations, including community-based organizations, and being open and transparent about that.
This will be a provocative question. Do governments do this kind of work well enough?
I think from a local government perspective, there is a way of being progressive about it. But I think state government, at least in Queensland, I think there's still room for improvement with how do we meet local needs, as well as what needs to be done from a larger policy perspective for urban development and sustainable development even. I would say local council, and this is not all local councils, there has been a lot of scrutiny in at least Southeast Queensland for different councils, understanding that Southeast Queensland is not actually one council. This is like 11 to 12 different councils. Brisbane is actually one of the largest local councils in the world. So it's a large amount of land and people that needs to be managed, but that doesn't mean that it's all done correctly. That's what I mentioned with community dissent in inner city areas. And then the further out you go from the city, the more that you find local residents feeling disconnected with their local council because of currently what's happening with the cost of living crisis, and feeling that their council won't be there to listen to them because all they're doing is charging them more rates and more fees. So how can they actually meaningfully engage with local residents to improve a place? That being said, I do think because particularly in urban development, there's 3 levels of government that is always involved in any aspect of improving infrastructure. And that can cause a lot of confusion amongst local residents, but also even when it comes to decision making and how that intersects with political agendas and state and local elections. Certain priorities change as the election cycles change. And that brings on this aspect of short-termism that really isn't sustainable when it comes to designing developments that last for a long time. That's what we're seeing with housing at the moment is a huge demand of the need for housing. But whether this housing stock is actually sustainable for the long term is still yet to be seen, which is why there was a report that was sent out by planning experts from SGS Economics and Planning who commented about the need for state government to respond to the housing crisis, and for them to seek community feedback is really important because there is a great potential for them to avoid urban sprawl and I guess what I would coin as negligent design, in the sense of how do you design for demand, but also ensuring that it is livable for 20 plus years, that it's not development that needs to be reassessed and reconstructed over time, and spending more money on it that could be avoided. And this is the whole difference between green development and infill development. And as someone personally who has lived in a master planned suburb, I can see the benefits of taking the time to design and engage meaningfully with local communities, but also how do you meet the demands of a basic human right when there is no housing stock to meet that? And so that is a huge argument and a huge point of debate in the sector of how do we meet demands, but also lower the cost when it comes to sustainable regenerative design, when green development takes up a lot of time and planning, whereas infill development doesn't.
In episode 264, Robert Pradalin talks about the Australian Housing Alliance, and he is especially in favor of sweating the existing infrastructure. It's a very fun explanation on how we could utilize our existing housing stock to solve or at least a bit alleviate the housing crisis. However, I assume that this housing crisis and the short-termist approach are huge concerns for you. What are the 3 biggest concerns or fears regarding the future of cities for you?
There's a few. I wouldn't say there's only 3. Going back to this whole notion of community engagement and I would say deep listening, I have a bit of a concern around what is it like to truly listen to Indigenous knowledge and understanding that the way in which we design and socialize within a city, if it's not responsive to how we exist within local ecological and cultural contexts, development can become unsustainable or it does not have generational continuity. And that's really important from a city legacy, but also building the character of a place. What we mentioned before around people being connected to a place. I think development, urban development, infrastructural development has a great potential for building long-lasting cultural ties to a place. But if that is constantly changing because of short-termism, how do people connect to a place? How do they find their ground and roots in a place if the urban landscape is constantly changing? Working alongside design agencies and planners, as well as community-based organizations and other agencies that embody and have a central place of Indigenous knowledge. Usually those who are Indigenous have a lot of knowledge to share around this and what it means to design for country, both from an urban development perspective, but an ecological and environmental conservation or preservation perspective. I would say another point of concern for me is perhaps an inability to coordinate across sectors. Part of what I see a lot, again, local to Southeast Queensland, I cannot talk for other regions, but perhaps it might be similar, is being collaborative. And I think this is a huge point of concern for a lot of people who are quite vocal across development and planning, landscape architecture, geography, whatever discipline they may be, that is quite interlinked with all of these issues is cross-cultural collaboration and cross-sectoral collaboration. We'll struggle, I think, to actually build sustainable, climate-sensitive and responsive urban regions if we actually cannot collaborate with sectors that are quite different to us. So part of this concern is, and also it is a strength, I would think, because there is a shift happening. But there has been concern amongst professionals that I work with that are in the social evaluation space of staying accountable to strategic targets around sustainable development and whether these are actually strategic goals for developers and those in infrastructure development. What does it look like? Have they actually planned it out? Do they have a framework of measuring and keeping themselves accountable to it? And if not, who are they working with to make that happen? We're seeing that happen a lot more, though, because of this rising, I wouldn't say trend, but a rising need to incorporate social evaluation and inclusion through planning and infrastructural development. And so you're seeing that a lot more with procurement in the construction space, as well as parts of urban development. But I think that needs to happen more. If we're not going to see a shift in that from a sector-wide perspective and not just specific to certain local regions, then it's going to be really hard to actually, for even construction or development businesses and industries to stay accountable to the built environment that they're putting a lot of money into. And environmental KPIs is only one side of the picture, as well as KPIs for economic development. What about the social? That's where my profession and the people that I get to work with, a lot of our concern is how do we actually bridge that knowledge gap with people where there is an industry that is so deeply embedded in environmental regulation and reporting that social reporting and evaluation is not considered on the same level. That becomes really important when we're seeing tension points around the housing crisis and people's connectedness to a city, whether young people want to even move into city suburban areas if the cost of living crisis is so high. So you're seeing more professionals moving away from the city. And so you have all these cumulative effects happening across different levels of society and different generations that, in essence, urban planning could help to solve. But whether this happens because they change different policies or whether this happens because it's due to collaboration across multiple sectors, I think that's yet to be seen.
I would like to go back to your first fear when you talked about how to create environments where people can be really connected to the place, become really local. You said something that the always changing environments don't help that kind of connection to be established. In my research, I heard design professionals, architects, urban planners, and engineers talk about the always changing nature of humans and with that cities. Because as humans evolve, so do cities. And the city which doesn't evolve is just that. How can we create such rooting connections with places if we also acknowledge that the places need to evolve because humans need to evolve? Not humans need to evolve, but humans do evolve.
Great question. And also acknowledging that cultures, I guess a global culture of a city evolves too, based on who migrates there and how they build upon it through economic development and innovation. I love this question because this is talked about a lot in the circles I'm in. And there's a few urban professionals that I know, they're First Nations and they are very deeply embedded with urban placemaking and planning. And I think acknowledging that First Nation countries, they're so vast and they're so diverse. They don't have the same geographies as how local city councils are designed and where their boundaries are. So designing across different cultures with different cultural groups and understanding that how they value resources and the natural habitats, how design can be responsive to how those local areas actually are and how that differs. That would look very different another 10 kilometers down the road or another 15. Reflecting that by working with and consulting with First Nations consultants and designers and those who have cultural knowledge, and to reflect that as cultural heritage that is integral to the land, I think is quite important. But also, it is always inherent to reflecting how cities evolve, because it is now reflecting how the land evolves and how people are connected to it. And also what is, at least from my perspective and from what I've learned from other First Nation colleagues, what is true to how the land shapes itself depending on a changing climate. So vegetation in one part of Southeast Queensland, or let's say one part of Brisbane City, on one side of the river looks very different from the other. So development that completely eradicates those areas of vegetation can actually disrupt a lot of the natural environmental balance in that space versus maybe another 15 kilometers down the road. Vegetation is much different. The way in which the land is shaped is much different. The way in which people might interact there might look different. So I think planning and design that is responsive to how the land is not only shaped, but also the cultural customs and the knowledge that is integral to that place, and how design can actually reflect that, planning can reflect that, which then might lend itself to how do we actually design for high density versus low density? Which areas are more prone and better for it, rather than putting a general layout of which zones or which urban regions should have 5 stories versus 2 stories versus this is only commercial and this is only retail. And I do understand there's a lot of complex planning and policy design around that. But again, is this responsive to how people actually engage with the land and how the environment is actually designed in that region? What does cultural heritage actually look like? I think there's so much potential for open unlearning and design in this space for the planning sector in working with First Nations designers and cultural knowledge holders, because this is the only way, I think, in which we can actually design climate responsive and responsible design for urban regions, let alone regional areas. But from an urban development perspective, I think it's quite integral to the future of a city to actually be responsive, integrating Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous design principles into the built environment.
I'm glad that it's not just me who is mulling over these questions, and thank you so much for your appreciation for the question itself. And I loved that although you were describing fears and concerns, you were already talking about the opportunities hidden in those fears and concerns. What are the 3 biggest opportunities regarding the future of cities for you?
The one that stands out to me the most is the shift, the generational shift that's happening in these professions, because now you're seeing a lot more people who are 30 and under who are stepping into these professions, and they have a very different mindset, I would say, in terms of what they value and what design looks like and what sustainable development looks like, including community engagement, because of the values that they hold, but also their lived realities. Young people, young professionals are quite vulnerable in this economy. And so I think, ironically, because they are so vulnerable, they have nothing left to lose. So they're quite vocal about things. These sentiments actually then translate into their profession, which they want to see, because now we have nothing to lose, right? So what can we change with the profession that we hold in designing and collaborating with people to make things more equitable for our own futures? So it does come from both the individualistic perspective, but also collectively. A lot of young professionals, including myself, we're not just doing this because we think differently, but because this is possibly the cultural and the social shift that's needed internally in our workplaces, particularly in planning and development, that needs to happen. I think the second is contrary to what I mentioned about collaboration. I am seeing a shift, though, in the ability to open doors and to unlearn ways in which to collaborate with different agencies. I am seeing a lot more movement in procurement and what this means in reporting and measurement and evaluation in a few sectors, construction being one of them, certain independent consultants and agencies in design wanting to work with more agencies and more consultants around community engagement. This also stems into aspects of planning and design around disaster management. What does this look like when we can do this together and collaboratively? How do we build more disaster sensitive and climate sensitive built environments? And that is always done collaborative point of view. At Lismore and the Northern Rivers being a really good example of what it was like for them to experience really devastating disasters in the past few years, and how the community, the local citizens actually coming together and bringing people from all walks of life and professions, from academics to disaster management, emergency services to the Red Cross, to even community-based organizations, to understand what it's like to reimagine a new city now that they could basically start from scratch. And that's happening on a really amazing cross-sectoral scale. But I think that could happen across multiple cities, at least starting on the east coast of Australia. because we are in a country that is so prone to disasters, how do we actually design and build cities in a way that's responsive to disasters that we might not be able to see now, but are predicted in the future? And how can we do that in a cross-cultural and cross-sectoral way? I am at least positively seeing that there's a shift in this now because of different mandates and policies around procurement, and also the rise of the social innovation and social business sector and the advocacy efforts they're putting in from a state and federal level perspective, and how that has a trickle-down effect even to urban planning and development. I think the last thing is it's all connected. I would say the global momentum around responding to the climate crisis and how that has shifted into local contexts is taking center stage now in a lot of conversations around design, planning, but also how communities mobilize together. And this links again to the generational shift that we're seeing in the workforce of what they think of first is how do we actually make a place livable? How do we design for not just disaster, but also livability in the next 30 to 50 years? So going beyond even just what is traditionally seen as long-term, which might be 10 to 20 years, but even beyond that, because of this need to solve something that is so multifaceted and complex, the way that has translated to a local context even changes the way in which people connect together from not just the built environment, but from a well-being perspective, and understanding how the urban development and the design space and those sectors can actually be responsive to that and help facilitate healthier communities through responsive and community-informed design.
Throughout your fears and opportunities, the social aspects came through very strongly. What is this social cohesion, and what does social cohesion mean to urban planning?
I was careful not to use it because it is something that I've been talking with a few close colleagues about as a controversial term. Social cohesion is quite well known, but I think over time, particularly for those who are in impact measurement and evaluation, what does it mean? I think it's become a term that might have multiple meanings. And again, it's similar to the term of community engagement. What does it mean depending on the context and the sector and the professionals behind it who are helping to facilitate it? Social cohesion has so many different, I think, aspects of it. And there's been a lot of money that's been injected into supporting social cohesion and development. So over the past 4 to 5 years, $71 million has been put into social cohesion measures. And over the past few years, and in between those 4 to 5 years, many of us in the evaluation, social impact, social business sectors have been questioning what it means when you're not actually seeing tangible outcomes from measuring social cohesion. And I think part of that is because a lot of the funding packages that are put into this is put into a predetermined view of what it means. And that is around multiculturalism and inclusion. And if we solve for issues around inclusion and equity from a workforce perspective or community resilience perspective, then that is what social cohesion is. But right now, we're actually seeing a lot of the opposite. We're seeing a lot of dissent in communities. We're seeing a lot of polarization. Just the other day, there was far-right political groups protesting on the streets here in the city and came and crashed another public demonstration that was happening for solidarity for Palestinians, which was a protest that was done legally because they had put in the request to protest together in a certain square in the city. On top of that, you've seen a lot of dissent and conflict between different social groups and how this conflates across different classes and social groups around well-being as well. Social cohesion it's such a loaded term, but its meaning has been lost, I think, when it comes to a practical point of view of measuring and keeping yourself accountable to it from an evaluation and policymaking perspective, because it's such a broad term. Relating that to urban planning makes it so much more difficult because there's no definitive aspect of it. Social cohesion could look like well-being in one regard, or it could look like inclusion and equity in workplaces and what that looks like from hiring and cultural development within workplaces. And I think that because it's so broad, it becomes really hard for it to be actioned upon in planning and development, let alone in capacity building or community-based projects and groups. It's a point of controversy and debate in some sectors, including the ones I'm part of, and how that relates to urban planning development I actually don't know fully because I've yet to have a chat with different friends and colleagues in this space. But I do find that it is such a term that is used commonly in the well-being space as well as in politics. And I think it is more of a term that can be used to communicate that certain groups and people are doing something for the betterment of people and their well-being versus actually showing cause for it. Because it is actually hard from a qualitative inquiry and research perspective to share that region A has better social cohesion than region B. What does that mean? There's so many different factors that could be part of that, from well-being to economic prosperity to livability to accessibility to anything. So broad that I think it's lost its meaning, and therefore it doesn't have the same level of influence as it could have had when it was first announced as a priority means of action back in 2019 when Peter Dutton announced that funding package of 71 million.
I learned today that I shouldn't use social cohesion anymore. Ishara, you have been very generous with your time and answers. What is your role in establishing the future of cities?
For me, as someone who is more in the side of community engagement and working with different clients and stakeholders around being that facilitator between client and local groups, I'm very embedded in that space. And being someone who could be a translator between those who are the masses and have a lot of opinions and feedback and suggestions for very few groups who hold a lot of social and political power around decision-making for the future of a city. My role that is integral to how do we shape the future of our cities, or at least where I'm based here. And that is technically between Brisbane and Logan, which are two different cities, and seeing how to work with other people cohesively and from a base of trust and alignment, values alignment, to understand that maybe a client or someone, an agency is not actually out to get you. They're not actually here to push a certain agenda, but they need to be met in the middle. And the same goes for community. Therefore, holding that role is complex. There's not a lot of people who do this, and a lot who do work quite closely with industries and sectors that find it's important to bring in consultants and agencies that have these skills. And again, a lot of this is usually in the nonprofit space as well, but extending this into planning and development, would love to see it done more on a larger scale. And it is quite different to social planning and placemaking, which have different processes. But this is about, again, that iterative process around community engagement and making sure you've got active, informed citizens, because in the end, that does relate to how healthy your democracy is, how healthy your political system is. If you've got a citizenry that is more engaged with their local government and their state government even, and how decisions are made for them, and if not, is it done with them?
Do you have any closing comments or requests for the audience?
This has been such a wonderful conversation, but something that I wish that people would take from this is the need for collaboration. So reaching out, if this is the aspect of, if this is a conversation that has made you quite curious as to what it's like to work with different people for the betterment of a local region and what cross-sectoral collaboration could look like, then definitely reach out. And perhaps this is something to raise in your own workplace. If you work in a small planning agency, or even if you work in a government agency, I think asking these questions internally and questioning processes is how things start, right? We don't change if we don't start questioning what we see. This is something, honestly, has been a bit of a pet peeve of mine, which is why I think I felt disillusioned and didn't want to work in the planning sector, because it was very difficult to see how it would change. And part of that is also because of how the workforce is composition. It follows a meritocracy. And on top of that, you are working a lot with developers. And even if you want to do a certain type of work, it might not just make the cut. So I think the more that people internally within these sectors are questioning the way in which design and development and meaningful engagement with multiple local stakeholders is done, then the more that you actually build that momentum for change, and change that is lasting for the health and future of our cities. I guess there's two things. One, be curious about cross-cultural collaboration and cross-sectoral collaboration. Two, being curious and questioning and bringing up these questions internally in your space, in your workspace.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was really interesting to hear from Ishara about the controversy of social cohesion. not to mention their description of human geography. Anthony Kent talked about economic geography in episode 108. You can find out more about Ishara online. All the links are in the show notes. What was the most interesting part for you? What questions did arise regarding Ishara's approach to the future of cities? What have you learned from this interview? Let me know on Twitter at WTF4Cities or on the WTF4Cities.com website where the transcripts and show notes are available. You can also subscribe on the website not to miss any new episodes and leave some feedback. I hope this was an interesting interview for you as well, and thanks for tuning in.
What is the Future for Cities podcast?